Well, hi everyone, this is Leatherass with PokerStrategy.com. Today we have a video on playing 3-bet pots in and out of position, both when you're the one doing the 3-betting and when you're the one calling the 3-bet. Now, this is sort of an interesting topic because I think most people struggle with it. I know that it's been something that I've struggled with and had to do a lot of work on to become successful in 3-bet pots, both when I'm the 3-better and when I am the one calling the 3-bet. It is a really hard spot in No Limit Hold'em, and a lot of people struggle with it. And if you're struggling with these and you'd think you're a pretty good player otherwise, don't get down on yourself. I'm sure you are a good player, and that your struggles in these spots are very common. In fact, when it comes to playing 3-bet pots, when you are the one calling the 3-bet, it is very, very difficult to make money in those spots. There's very few people that can do it, and I've struggled with it personally, and truthfully, in 3-bet pots, when I'm the one calling the 3-bet, it hasn't been a great source of profit. Now, I've been able to find spots, and I'll talk about those that are profitable, but it is one of those situations where it's very difficult, especially if you're the one calling the 3-bet. Now, if you're the one doing the 3-bet, that's where I think the greatest source of profit is. Obviously, if I think that people are losing money when they're calling 3-bets, then it would be good to 3-bet. That would only make sense. It's one of those situations where a lot of emotion becomes involved. Oftentimes people get 3-bet a lot and they react emotionally rather than trying to react in such a way that is really just designed to make the most profit. And so, there's a lot I have to say about playing 3-bet pots, and so we'll just go ahead and get started here. Now, when it comes to 3-bet pots, it all sort of starts pre-flop. At least in my mind, anyway, it does for me. It's really important to know how you're going to react. It's very easily, I just did mention earlier how it's easy to react emotionally. A lot of times people will get 3-bet pretty frequently by someone, and they don't really have a particular game plan on how to handle the 3-better. And that's generally a spot where you just want to table, I should say you'd rather not start to fight back emotionally. It'd be better just to fold way too much, maybe more than you should technically. But what you do by doing that is avoid making a much larger error if you don't really understand completely how to play these situations. So first off, I would say that if you're struggling with 3-bet pots and you haven't figured out exactly how to handle your opponent in these spots, just go ahead and fold. That's I think by far the better play. If for example you're playing a 1-2 game online and you're raising someone to $5, $6, and they 3-bet you, the most, and you fold, the most you can make is a really small mistake. Maybe you could lose your initial investment in the pot of 2.5 or 3 blinds. It's much better to do that than to to start to get involved in a lot of 3-bet pots where you may not completely understand exactly how to handle your opponent in those spots. Now, obviously, we're mostly worried about people who 3-bet pretty actively, because people that 3-bet with a very narrow range, we don't really have too much of a problem figuring out that, because they generally just have strong ranges, and you certainly can't be making a mistake by just folding, a hand like Ace-Jack or Ace-Queen, sometimes even Ace-King if the person is really tight. You just really can't make much of a mistake there. So we're mostly focused in this video on people who have a pretty high 3-betting propensity. And one thing that I think is very important and is something that I've used over the years is I begin to develop a plan on what I'm going to do before I even enter the pot. For example, if I have a marginal hand like say a king-jack suited, and I'm going to raise in the cutoff, and I anticipate that the button is someone who's going to 3-bet an extremely wide range with their button. I'm going to know more or less how I'm going to react to that 3-bet before it even happens. I think it's very important to have some understanding of what you're going to do. Are you going to call and then check raise really light, possibly all in post flop with a really wide range of spots? Are you just going to fold pre-flop? What you don't want to do is raise, get 3-bet, not really know what you're going to do, and then react emotionally, because that's generally sort of a recipe for problems. Another thing that's going to be really important is knowing how exactly to size your raises to start with, because that's going to play into how you're going to play a 3-bet pot. Now, for example, if you make it 4x on the button and you're going to get 3-bet potentially to 13, 14, 15 blinds by your opponent, that's going to alter your strategy significantly than if you're just making a min raise to 2x and then you're going to get 3-bet to 7, 7.5x. The pot is much, much smaller when you're calling a 3-bet in that spot, and therefore is going to greatly affect the strategy of how you play that opponent post-flop, as well as what types of hands you might want to be calling with. If you have to call 15 blinds, well, you put in 4 and call, say, 11 more. If you're making it 4x, well then there's just going to be a much narrower range of hands, in my opinion, that you're going to be able to continue with. Whereas if you're calling 3-bets, especially in position, say if you're the one on the button making a min raise and someone from the blinds 3-bets you to 7 blinds, well, that changes everything. It changes the types of hands you can call with. It changes the lines you might take post-flop. It just changes all sorts of stuff, and we'll go more into that as the video progresses. Typically, if you're against a very active opponent, someone who's 3-betting, I mean, you will encounter certain players, especially at any sort of reasonable stakes, even 1, 2, all the way up to certainly 25, 50 and beyond. You're going to get players that, especially in 100 big blind games, that are going to have very high 3-bet percentages. I've encountered plenty of people that 3-bet out of the blinds to a steal 20+% of the time. And in those types of opponents, it's going to be very important to size your pre-flop raises properly. I mean, you don't want to make it 4x and risk, for example, $8 to win 3 in a 1-2 game on the button when if you have 2 people in the blinds that are 3-betting 20-25% against a steal. You stand, at least, especially if you're someone that folds quite a bit to 3-bets, then they might even be 3-betting you in particular a higher percentage of the time, in which case they might be 3-betting over 50% between the 2 blinds put together, and you're risking 8 to win 3 and folding to a 3-bet a lot. Well, that's going to be a losing proposition. So generally against really aggressive players with really high 3-bets, I'm going to alternate sometimes between just simply tightening my range and not trying to steal from them as much, and to possibly stealing plenty, but just making it a min raise, maybe making it to 4, and so now you're only risking 4 to win 3, and now you're in a situation where you have stand a much better chance of playing the hand profitably. By risking 4 to win 3, obviously you have some strong hands in your range as well, and some of the time will win big pots just by virtue of having a hand that you want to 4-bet and get it in with. There's all sorts of additional ways you can make money beyond just the aspect of risking 4 to to win 3, but I think you guys kind of get my point. You don't want to be risking 8 to win 3 on a 50-50 proposition. So you want to be making your raise sizes certainly smaller against really aggressive players. Now, if you encounter players that rarely ever 3-bet, and maybe their mistake is calling too much out of the blinds, well, by all means, go ahead and make it 8, because they're just going to be playing bigger pots against you out of position, which is going to be a good thing for you. And it's certainly going to be important to know which types of hands you will want to play in various positions depending on the type of opponents. Now, if there's a weak opponent in the blinds, I would certainly recommend, especially if you're in a steal position, to get involved with all sorts of playable hands. I'm certainly getting involved if there's, for example, a player that doesn't 3-bet super high from the button, and I have a weak player or two in the blinds. Well, I'm definitely playing a 7-4 suited, for example, a hand as weak as that from the cutoff. And I'm likely, if they're not super aggressive and maybe their mistake is calling too much, I'm likely making my 3-bets bigger. But even if they are weaker players who are maybe overly aggressive, 3-bet you a lot, then I'm most likely going to min-raise those types of hands, and when they do 3-bet, definitely heavily consider making a call. Now, if you're in the cutoff and you have a weaker hand, and there's, or you have a marginal hand where you're trying to decide whether you want to play it or not, and there's a particularly good opponent on the button, that's going to be a good spot where you're going to want to tighten your range. One person's videos that I will watch a fair amount of, that I'm sure most of you have heard of, is Phil Galfon. There's another person named Dr. Giggy, who I think is also really strong, who I'd watch a number of videos from, and I've heard each of them say that essentially, and this is something I completely agree with myself, that if you have someone that you're directly out of position against, that is really, really strong and really, really aggressive, 3-betting you wide, but also playing well after that, making correct 5-bet jams if you start 4-betting too light, or as an adjustment, or if you start calling too much out of position, that's generally going to be playing right into their hands. You just don't really have a whole lot of great options, and so generally I just recommend leaving the table when you have a particularly good player that you're directly out of position against, and so that's going to greatly affect the types of hands that you're going to be able to play. And also keep in mind what your image is like when you're opening a lot of, or when you're deciding whether to open a hand. If you just raised, sometimes you just get really good cards right in a row. You might get an ace-jack, a pocket queens, and say a pocket kings, and then the next hand you get something like a jack-10 offsuit, or you get like an ace-10 offsuit from the cutoff, and you have a bunch of people behind you that maybe have let you take the last few pots. Well, there's definitely a strong argument can be made for even folding some of the weaker part of your range in a situation like that, where you've opened a bunch of pots in a row, even though hands that you would normally be able to show a profit from, like I have, for example, with ace-10 offsuit over the years from the cutoff, I've certainly shown a profit in those spots, but it hasn't been a big one. And if I have people that are raring to 3-bet me because I have opened so many pots in a row recently, and maybe they have some high 3-bet percentage as well, perhaps that might be a good time to just go ahead and pass on a hand like that. So it's always important to keep in mind what your image is like, because ace-10 offsuit is going to be a type of hand where it's going to be very difficult to show a profit in a 3-bet pot. In fact, I'm almost positive you're not going to be able to be calling 3-bets with ace-10 offsuit and make any money. So because it's a hand that you're often going to have to fold, or you should probably almost always fold in those spots, then why not just not play it? Now, after you decided which hands to sort of selectively open against which type of opponents, and how to size your raises, it's obviously one of the truly most difficult parts of playing 3-bet pots is going to be post-flop play. it's definitely going to be important to know what types of hands to call with, and I'll sort of go over some different types of hands and how I might react with those different types of hands depending on the opponent. And so, to start off, one thing that's going to be really important is to pay attention to what stack sizes will become if you call a 3-bet. We talked a little bit about that earlier, but it's important to go over it again. Some people have very just different ways of 3-betting people. I've encountered opponents. Well, I will min raise and make it 20, and maybe they are fairly active 3-betters, and they make what I feel is a pretty big mistake in doing things like making it 110, or excuse me, if for example we're at a 1-2 game and we make it $4, and some will just go ahead and make it $20, $22, and so they're making it 10, 11 blinds to come back over the top of you. And those types of opponents that 3-bet really wide and then make their 3-bets really big, I'll actually take certain types of hands like ace-x suited, and just because they've invested so much money in the pot, I now have a more profitable shove if stacks are right. If stacks are, say, 100 big blinds, and I min raise ace-3 suited and make it 4, and somebody makes it 22 back at me, or 24, which I think is a big mistake. Well, now they've put in so much in the pot with a range that is really, really weak. They might be somebody, for example, who 3-bets 22% in those spots. Well, they so rarely have a hand that they can call an all-in with that I will take a hand like 2s or ace-3 suited, or a hand that's generally overall in decent shape against their calling range. And I probably slightly prefer, I might slightly prefer an ace-x suited, but it's not a big deal. I mean, I think it's real close either way over a pair, but I think the equities are going to be pretty close. And I'll just go ahead and just go straight all in, because they can only call with such a small percentage of the range that I'll just continually win 11, 12 blinds when they do that. And then the times that I get called, especially when I have, say, ace-2 of spades, and I have 30% against basically anything they call with other than aces, I don't mind taking the worst of it, the rare time that they're able to call, because I'm essentially free rolling it off of all the money I've won. So that's just sort of an odd example. There's not too many opponents like that, but they exist, and they've existed in my experience even at limits like 5, 10, and 10, 20, which I'm surprised maybe they'd progress that far with making such a big error, but hey, if those come along, it's important to take advantage of it. Generally, though, you encounter people who you make it 20, for example. I keep using that example. I apologize because I'm used to playing 5-10 so much. But let's use 1-2 for example. So I make it 4, and they tend to make it 13 or 14, and now you're in a spot where you can call with all sorts of hands in position. But it's very important not to just have sort of a fit or fold mentality. You want to be looking for boards that you can represent a lot of different things on, but we'll go into that later on. Now, in terms of the types of hands that I would be inclined to call with 3-bets, I'm not a big offsuit Broadway fan. I'm not super inclined to call a 3-bet with King-Jack offsuit. I don't think it creates quite enough semi-bluffing opportunities for me post-flop. The hand is dominated when I get action a lot of times on King-high and Jack-high boards. It's just going to be sort of a difficult hand to really play properly. I like pots that highly often flop at least a couple of backdoors, or at least pair and flush draws, or flush draws quite a bit. I think those types of hands are much better, because ultimately what usually wins 3-bet pots against people with wide ranges is whoever sort of wants it the most. And it's important when you're bluffing or semi-bluffing or semi-bluffing when you have hands that sort of have like really weak draws, like 2 back doors. It's just nice to have a little bit of equity in the pot. It gives you a little bit of a discount on your bluff, and so I tend to like those types of hands over offsuit broadways that tend to mostly just miss a lot of flops, don't flop very many draws, any strong draws, we should say, and then get dominated from time to time. So I'm not a big fan of those. Suited Broadway is probably my favorite type of hand to call with. I'm certainly not really ever folding unless stacks are weird, with hands like Jack-10 suited, King-Jack suited, King-Queen suited. No way am I folding those hands. If I get a particularly good player at my table, if I'm happen to be sitting with somebody that's I deem is one of the better players at my stakes, or maybe the best player, or what have you, then I might be more inclined to give up some marginal spots. But against say your standard regular, I'm going to be super inclined to get involved in pots with suited Broadway type of hands. Now, suited connectors, I'm calling with less often, but I'm still calling a high percentage of the time. It's going to depend on stack sizes. As we get a little bit deeper, I'm going to be more inclined to call with suited connectors. And by deeper, I mean online deep, which is not very deep. Like once we get 140 blinds instead of having 100, for example. I much prefer deep stack play because, truthfully, not much of this video would apply to super deep stack play because ranges just change so much. But online, it's definitely important to know how to handle those, this 100 to 200 big blind stack range. Pairs are sort of interesting. Obviously, that pretty much one time out of 8, you're just going to be fist pumping, on the flop. When you call a 3-bet in position with pocket 4s, one time in 8, you're going to be really, really, really happy with your flop, and you have a decent chance of getting all the money in as an enormous favorite. And that's obviously the huge advantage of pairs. Now, the huge disadvantage of pairs is that the other 7 times out of 8 you don't flop anything, including no sort of draw. Well, I should say maybe one other time out of the 8 you flop something like an open-ender, or you flop something like an under pair but with a flush draw, like you have 4s and the flop's 6, 8, 9 with all spades, and you have the 4 of spades. You flop a lot of really marginal stuff. But then the 6 times out of 8, approximately, these aren't perfect numbers, but the other 6 times out of 8, you're just flopping hands that just really don't have much going for them. Pocket 4s on a King-Jack 7 board, for example, rainbow. Not much exciting there. But one thing that pairs can do is be used as a spot to sort of balance a bluff raising range post-flop. Now, if you get someone who 3-bets really wide and C-bets on the flop and 3-bet pots a really high percentage of the time, you get a lot of people that they may not C-bet 100%, but on a lot of different types of board textures, they will C-bet 100%. For example, if the flop comes King 6 deuce and you have pocket 4s, there's very few situations where an aggressive opponent would ever check that flop. And so on a board like that, they might be C-betting 100%. Now, we know they have wide ranges, and we know they're C-betting 100% of the time. On a flop like that, well, you don't want to get in the habit of trying to push someone off of their hand every single time. For example, you don't want to be calling 3-bets and then just making a flop raise no matter what the board texture is, and every single time making the flop raise. there was a day, as we were sort of all kind of figuring out poker, 2004, 5, 6, 7, that sort of period of time when regulars were nowhere near as good as regulars are today, that you might get somebody who 3-bets pretty wide and they'll c-bet the flop 100%, and then you bluff raise them and they give you credit for the nuts every time and fold everything that's not, a super strong draw or an overpair or, top pair, top kicker, 2-pair, hands like that, which are tough to hit. And so you could just make these sort of flop raises and they would work plenty often to be profitable. Now if you start doing that, people will, they'll just fight back. I'm not going to be able to get away with against a good player just calling a 3-bet in position and every king 6 deuce flop just bluff raising them, because I know it's hard for them to have ace king aces or sets or and they're going to have oftentimes a lot of under pairs that they 3-bet me with that don't really like getting raised. They're going to have a lot of junk, but it doesn't mean that they're just going to let me make flop raises against them every single time and just fold. And so I think, but I don't think that means you ditch the play entirely. I think that what it means is that you just make them less often. And one way that I like to balance that flop raising range in those spots is to when I call pairs in position, which is not always, because if stacks are only 100 big blinds and I make it 3x and somebody makes it 12x and I got to call 9 blinds, then it's not going to necessarily be a profitable spot to call there. But in the right situations, when I call with pairs in position, I will just use the times when I have pairs and don't hit any sort of hand or draw, and just make a flop raise on, say, 75% of the boards that come out, the better ones to make it on. I wouldn't do it too often on boards that are super likely to hit my opponent, like a Jack 10-8, and also boards that he might not c-bet 100% and might only c-bet when he is willing to come over the top of a raise and get all the money in. But on the board textures where they get fairly dry and there's not a lot of draws, and I'm going to take the pairs and just sort of raise them on those flops. And you get bailed out very occasionally. You might bluff raise a guy, for example, with 4s on a king 6 deuce, or you actually don't even know if it's a bluff raise. It might even be a value raise because his range is junk. But the point is to basically try and end the hand right there. And then very occasionally you get bailed out with like a 4 on the turn or river if your opponent just calls the flop raise. So it's it gives you like a little bit of a backup plan, but not really much of one. So anyway, that's I kind of like that play, and I've sort of gone through Hold'em Manager and filtered for those situations, and I've chosen good spots and been profitable in those spots. So I'm confident that that's a pretty good play. Now, one thing that's going to also be really important to know in 3-bet pots is what your opponent's tendencies are. Now, in 3-bet pots, I think my favorite type of opponent to play in a 3-bet pot is someone who has, who's someone who is kind of a nit, but they're not so much of a nit that they're only 3-betting you with premium hands, but you get these types of people who they are, professional grinders, and they're playing poker all the time, and they know that all the best players 3-bet quite a bit, so they implement that into their game, but then they haven't really done the work post-flop to really know how to play post-flop to the degree that would justify a higher 3-bet percentage, and therefore make a lot of post-flop mistakes. And you can just sort of own them in a lot of these, on a lot of different types of board textures, and those types of opponents are fantastic to to go ahead and play against, and they're actually somewhat common, at least as I make this video. I've noticed quite a bit of them, especially at 1-2 and 2-4, because that's kind of the limit a lot of times where people are just starting to get pretty good, but their game is not quite complete yet. And they're still working on it, and we've all been there, I've been there, and I'm certainly not trying to pick on anybody that's like that. That's probably actually a good percentage of people watching these videos. But what I am saying is that it is exploitable, and if you're someone who maybe thinks that they are in that category, this is a good, this could be a good segment of the video for you. So one thing that I like to do is I like to kind of test my opponent, especially if it's somebody who is someone who I play with quite a bit, and maybe they're newer to the games that I'll play. Maybe there's somebody who was at 2-4 and is now taking some shots at 5-10 or whatever it is. Just somebody I expect to play against quite a bit, and somebody that's I don't quite understand their tendencies yet. I like to sort of test them out and make, for example, a lot of the little bluff raises maybe more often than I might normally on the flop, like I just talked about a few moments ago with the pairs. I like to test out sort of their mentality in general. I will float them even when I have complete nothing. If I call a 3-bet with, say, pocket fives and the flop comes Jack 8-10 with 2 hearts, somewhat of a scary flop, I'll float that flop, not because I necessarily think I have the best hand. I really don't know what I have against their range, but I know that if they're the type of opponent that, or I want to, I guess the better way to say it is I want to find out if they're the type of opponent who will be more inclined to want to represent a scary card when they come in, or are they the type of people that will become scared. So, you take a Jack 10-8 with 2 hearts. I've got, say, 2 black fives. I call the 3-bet in position against the type of opponent I've described. Flop comes Jack 10-8, 2 hearts. I'm going to be inclined to float that flop and see how they react, because so often the turn's going to bring either a heart or some type of card that will put a straight on the board. And I want to see, are they the type of opponents that when they have, for example, ace-x suited that they 3-bet me with, say it's ace 3 of spades, and the flop's Jack 10-8 of hearts, are they going to bet it, and then if they don't get raised and a flush comes in or a straight comes in on the turn, are they just going to bet that hand again to try and push me off whatever I have, or are they going to check thinking, oh, that had to have completed something that Leatherass has in this position, and I better go ahead and give up. And it's not necessarily that giving up there would be a bad play, but I just want to know what their mentality is, because should I start floating every single scary flop against them and knowing that they might just give up in general just because maybe they're playing fit or fold anyway, or they might just decide that every time a draw comes in, well, it had to have completed my hand, and will just sort of give up. And so if that's the case, and I think that they're going to c-bet and sort of be done with it and not really look for spots to represent cards coming in, well, I'm going to float those players really wide and look for a lot of checks on the turn, and then make a lot of really cheap bluffs on the turn, like third pot, 40% of the pot bets on the turn, where I'm getting a really good price on my bluff, and just expect them to fold so much. So you really want to kind of test out your opponents and try and get a feel for whether or not they're the ones that use scare cards to scare you, or are they the ones that tend to get scared on these scary type boards. So I'll go ahead and use one example from a pot that I played against an opponent who 3-bets really wide, and at least my opinion of him at the time was that he would not necessarily try and just always represent really strong hands. If I represented sort of a hand that would be tricky to bluff off of, then he might be inclined to go ahead and what I call punt, meaning that just kind of give up. Like in football, you punt. You're just kicking the ball over the other team. You're done with it. Is he the type of player that's going to punt a lot? And if you're representing a hand that's, maybe he thinks that some of the time you might be able to bluff off, but he's not really sure how, what your range is like and what you're going to fold. And so we'll kind of run through this hand here. This hand actually doesn't illustrate exactly what I just said, but it's close. So I went ahead and called with suited Broadway. Like I say, I'm not folding suited Broadway. As you can see, this opponent plays 35% of their pots, their VPIP. Pre-flop raised 27. I don't remember what his 3-bet was. I don't have it up here. I think that 7.0 means 7%, but I guess what I mean is I think it's much more important to pay attention to their 3-bet buy position, which is, if you don't have that stat on there for Hold'em Manager, I would highly recommend making that stat easily accessible. I think for me it's on my pop-up. If I click on his name, it goes ahead and has a pop-up. And so I think this particular opponent might be 3-betting out of the blinds to steal position raise some absurd percentage of the time, like 22% or something, if I remember correctly. And so I knew his range was going to be super wide, and I had Queen Jack suited in position. I went ahead and called, and I flopped here a backdoor flush draw, and I flopped a gut shot nut straight draw. And so I thought after my opponent bet that I could go ahead and call profitably, thinking that my opponent would put me on some type of ace-jack type of hand that he probably wouldn't want to just run 3 barrels, knowing that his range is super wide pre-flop, knowing that I know that, and that I probably wouldn't just get rid of a hand like that probably at any point. Maybe I would just be calling with it. Now, I was actually planning, if he checked the turn, to go ahead and check behind, because I think in some respects that can represent just as much strength as betting the turn. I can't say, come to think of it, that was for sure what I was going to do, but I think that that is a perfectly fine option. A lot of times, for example, if an 8 of spades were to roll off, or a deuce of spades or something rolls off on the turn, then if my opponent checks, I can check, and then it sort of represents like, hey, if I had a hand that I was going to bluff with, if I was just floating you with some sort of queen, jack, king, queen, maybe just air from time to time type of hand, I would bet the turn, right? I mean, I got checked too, I'm going to go ahead and bet the turn, but by checking the turn behind, sometimes now it's like, I've got that ace-7 that you thought I had, and I'm sort of confirming your confirming things in your mind that way, because, if I had a bluff, I would bet, right? And sort of try and get him in that frame of mind, and get him to just also check the river, which I don't think, for example, if a 6 of spades comes off and then a 9 of diamonds comes, that he's going to now start trying to get me off of that ace-8 or ace-jack with a river bet. So I think once, checks the turn, it's likely just giving up completely, or the opponent is going for some sort of check raise on the turn. And so I was, on most blank turns, I was probably going to check, but I both alternate between betting and checking, and I think both are fine. But anyway, I just want to describe sort of the options going through my head here. And so I go ahead and call. And in some respects, it's not even a bad call, even if I weren't going to make a play, because I will hit my king, and if my opponent, has some sort of, top pair type of hand, he's probably going to go ahead and be willing to go broke with it. And so I'm getting, a half decent price just to draw to the king. It's not that that would be profitable in itself, but that's a pretty good backup plan for clean outs. So now on the turn, the absolute joker hits the king of clubs, which is the best card in the deck for me, and then as it turns out, the best card in the deck for getting action as well. And my opponent checks. Well, now I'm hoping that it's my only way to sort of start to get paid. I can't get paid in a pot of 234, and my opponent is 500 behind without betting the turn. I can't get all of his stack. So I'm going to go ahead and make, even though I have the nuts in this case, and I guess an open-ended straight and royal flush draw in this case, I'm going to go ahead and bet a similar size that I would bet had I decided to bluff after, say, a six of spades came off. I'm going to bet a little under half the pot here. It gives me the ability to still get the money in. If he were to call here, the pot would be 220 plus 234 would be 454, and my opponent would have 389.35 left. So I have under a pot size bet left. So it's plenty to bet on the turn. In my opinion, it would be really, really bad to size your bet, something like close to pot or, 170, 180. It also takes away the ability for my opponent to do that, which is him getting the money in with 0% equity, which is always really nice. Now, this opponent, obviously, when he's checking the turn, isn't always giving up, but as we can see, choosing to sort of represent a really strong hand here at the check raise. But I really don't like it a whole lot, the check raise that he made in this spot, because I just don't think that his fold equity is going to be super high. If I floated him with an ace, jack, ace, queen, I'm super likely to either be checking back the turn or bet calling a check raise. Obviously, if I float him with a gut shot like I have, I just made the nuts. If I floated him with a king, queen, I more than likely wouldn't be betting the turn. There's just not a lot of hands in my range that I'm bet folding the turn with. And so I guess he's hoping that I have, some sort of ace-8, ace-9 that felt for some reason that they had to protect their hand, but felt that I would fold that hand. But that's, that's not what I would call sound logic. And, this player sort of bounces around in stakes, I'm sure. Just maybe doesn't play consistently well, or doesn't have, maybe isn't quite there on the thought process on playing these stakes. I don't know, but if I really don't like this bet. Might have just been a good player, but on tilt, I don't know. This is not my favorite play in the world. I would actually rather see my opponent do something like bet into 234 on the flop, or going into the turn, I should say, bet something like $65, and then maybe consider overbet jamming the turn. Maybe like the 65 would tempt me to call it the ace-8, but then I would, to a pot-size bet on the river, if the club doesn't get there, I would get scared. Maybe he could use that mentality. Plus, a small bet lets him lay the price. It's really hard for me to have a hand that I would raise him with on the turn. Obviously, in this case, I would have had a hand that, could raise him on the, should raise him on the turn. But it's really hard for me to have that type of hand, and so opponent could just go ahead and make a small bet and almost always just get called in those spots. So I think that would have probably been a better option in this case for this particular opponent. But anyway, I thought that was sort of an interesting hand example that I would share. Now, one other opponent tendency that I think is super exploitable is, to find opponents, and that's why it's important to test them out, as I mentioned earlier in the video, is to find opponents that play fit or fold post flop. People that are the one and done, as I like to call them, type of opponents. These are opponents who make their continuation bet a high percentage of the time, and then just give up. Those are great opponents because if they're playing sort of fit or fold, you can just raise them a lot on the flop after floating a 3-bet in position. You can float really wide ranges on boards that are even remotely scary and represent them when they come in. So we talked a little bit about that, but it's important to try and continually look for those types of opponents and mark them and take good notes on their mentality. It's important to take notes on people's mentalities in 3-bet pots because when you're against really, really super strong players, it's going to be really hard to find an edge, and you can usually just fold pre-flop in those spots. But when you find people who have really exploitable tendencies, then you want to just be getting involved in a lot of 3-bet pots with them because they are so exploitable, and there's so many different types of boards that you can put pressure on them and continually get away with it. One thing I would look for is when your opponent checks, are they always giving up? And what I mean is, when they 3-bet you, say you call in position, and they check the flop, is that always a check fold? If they c-bet the flop and check the turn, do they have much of a check raising range on the turn, or are they generally just giving up? These are the types of opponents you can you can sort of have some fun with when they're always giving up. I mean, if they bet the turn that their range is really strong, and you can just generally give up the hand when you're not super strong. But when they check, the pot's sort of yours. It's just kind of a green light situation. And as we know in poker, you generally flop marginal hands. You generally don't flop hands that you're like, wow, let's get all the money in as fast as possible here. I love my hand. Typically people are, if they're 3-betting tens, there's like one over card on the flop. If you call that flop against that opponent, if they 3-bet, for example, tens, and the flop's jack 8 deuce, are they going to have a line like c-bet the flop, and if they get called and they check the turn to sort of, because they don't really know where they stand, and then they sort of check fold, to a bet, and they are sort of just praying the turn goes check, check. Now, if you get those types of opponents, then they're just going to be flopping marginal hands so much more often than they're flopping really strong hands, and so you're going to want to become involved in those against those opponents as often as possible. And one person that does that to perfection on TV, as you'll see, is Tom Dwan. I think we all know a little bit about Tom Dwan's game, and he's calling 3-bets super wide, and he's not calling because he thinks he has the best hand. He's not calling because he thinks he's going to flop a draw and get all the money in good, or I should say rather, he's going to flop a draw and semi-bluff his opponent every time, but rather he's calling 3-bets in position, especially because he knows that his opponent will generally play so face up. You get these guys who are honestly terrible at cash game poker, like Howard Lederer or Andy Block or Mike Matisow, or guys like this that play No Limit Hold'em, and they play their hand very face up, and those are some of the characters you'll see on these Poker After Darks and high stakes pokers and stuff like that. He just knows that if the flop's jack 6 deuce, and he's sitting there with his queen 3 of clubs, and the flop's jack 6 deuce, that and he just called a 3-bet, that he can he can get away with so many bluff raises on the flop because people are going to have so many missed overcards and under, pairs like 10s and 9s, and he's just going to be able to get away with it so often, or he's going to be able to float the flop and watch his opponent tremble on so many different turn cards, even when they do have decent hands, and he's just going to be able to take it away from them. And he just makes people play big pots all the time, and makes them, makes them basically have to go to showdown so often, and he wouldn't be doing that so much against Antonius, and he wouldn't be doing that so much against Phil Ivey, and he might for television from time to time, or something that he might just think it's fun to play against them sometimes and see what he can do. But in all honesty, he's not really going to be calling a Queen 3 of clubs against Patrick Antonius in position, thinking that that's the most, that that's necessarily a profitable line. If he's playing for profit, though, he's going to be, generally folding in those spots against the really good players. But then the Andy Blocks and the Howard Letters and some of these other clowns that really don't know how to play cash game poker, those are going to be the types of people that you'll notice him really have a hand and just continually kind of apply pressure. So since people like that play so face up, you're going to want to identify who those people are and mark them and take good notes on them, and just basically exploit them. Do they always fire a continuation bet? Well, that's obviously, if you find a leak like that, if you find somebody that c-bets in a 3-bet pot, under 50% of the time, well, you can float their 3-bet every time, and you know that if they're check folding, say, half the time post-flop, then, it doesn't take a mathematician to figure out that that's going to be profitable, because you can just float them pre-flop and then bet every time they check, plus some of the time you flop really strong hands yourself, and you can win big pots, like when you flop 2-pair sets and stuff like that. And so those players are going to be really great when you find those. The trickier ones are the ones that c-bet like 70%, because they're c-betting just often enough to put you in a tough spot, but not so often that they're exploitable on one side, because they always have garbage, but they're not so exploitable that on the other side that they're just giving up so often that you can just watch them check every time they miss, and then you can just make a bet and instant profit. So and the last thing I sort of have here, and I think we'll wrap up the video from there, and this will be look out for the next video, because we'll be going through the rest of these PowerPoint slides, as well as showing you some hand examples and wrapping up this series. But can you credibly represent a hand? That's definitely going to be important to know when you can credibly represent a hand, if the person reads hands well, which generally people read hands well enough, for example, that on a jack, let's say for example you float a jack 10-8 flop and with 2 hearts, and someone bets in you and they call, or excuse me, someone bets in you and you call. The turn is a 3, and they bet into you again, and it's an offsuit 3, and you call, and the river's another 3, and they check to you, and you're sitting there with, king, queen, or something like that, and you decide to, the only way you can win the pot is to bet, because you have king high and you don't figure to have the best hand, and so you decide to bet, and then you just get quickly called by, like, pocket queens or something. It's a lot of people don't value bet thin enough, and that could be a whole nother series, but a lot of people, they don't really value bet super well, and they'll check behind all their queen jacks and king jacks on boards like that, or check back all their those types of hands. And so your opponent knows that when you bet there, like, you probably would have raised, because it's a draw heavy board, every time you had a set, or every time you had
an overpair or something like that. And so, and if you're not really value betting, say like an ace jack or something like that on that board, well, then your opponent knows when you're betting that you basically just have a misdraw every single time, because there's just no hand in your range that should be betting there, based on their experience with you. And so, make sure you can credibly represent a hand. I mean, granted, sometimes your opponent might be on a misdraw too and just be check giving up there, but oftentimes they won't be. They'll just think that it would be really hard to get 3 streets of value from a hand that's clearly looks like the top end of their range is ace jack, and decides that there's way more misdraws in your range and will just pick off your bluff. And you really don't want to be doing that. I mean, you need to make sure that you can represent something. I mean, even if it was just like an ace on the river and you had king, I guess if you had king queen there, then you would make the nuts and want to bet. But I guess you sort of get my point. If there's something that you can represent as betting, you're going to want to take advantage of that in spots where your opponent can almost never be super strong. But you want to make sure that you have some type of card where you can represent some type of hand when you're betting, and that's all going to be really important. So again, just to kind of wrap up some of my thoughts and just kind of leave you with some kind of parting thoughts. I hope you've kind of learned a lot, or hopefully at least something from this video. But if I had to stress anything, most importantly, what I feel is maybe the most important aspect of this video is to take the emotion out of your game and take the emotion out of 3-bet. Whatever you do, don't raise a hand, get 3-bet by a guy that 3-bets you a lot, and then just decide, all right, I'm sick of this. I'm gonna show him who's boss, and then just start making some play based off of the emotion that's been created by the situation. It's very important to do your work away from the tables and devise game plans for how to handle these opponents. Now, the next video, I will go into certain types of situations, board textures, where I'm going to want to be getting the money in super light against people that just relentlessly 3-bet. We're going to talk about certain types of plays that you can make that maybe you don't see a lot of people do, but they're actually profitable, and I've done the work away from the table to know that they're profitable from a mathematical perspective. And so we'll go over all that stuff later. But again, I've worked a lot with the poker mental game coach and fellow PokerStrategy.com coach Jared Tendler, who does videos on the mental game. And a lot of how he helps you actually make money at the tables is just preventing you from basically sort of beating yourself. And so if someone's 3-betting you a lot and you're becoming irritated, that's what they want. You are just playing right into their hands. So don't react that way. They want you to start playing irrationally in those spots. They want you to just make mistakes and try and get you off your game. And so just don't let them. If you don't know how to handle their aggressiveness, just say, you know what, I will beat you in the long run. You can just say this in your head, of course. Don't type it in the chat or say it to them in person. But just take the mentality, you know what, I will beat you in the long run. You will not own me. You are owning me right now, and this is a blip of time in our poker careers, in our respective poker careers. And much in the same way that in golf right now, there's 100 players playing better than Tiger Woods. No one's doubting who's better than Tiger Woods overall. And Tiger Woods isn't doubting that guys that he's probably barely even heard of are beating him right now on the golf course. He's not doubting who's actually the best player. This is a blip of time in a career. And hopefully your poker career is long and prosperous. And if someone is taking advantage of you right now and 3-betting you and you feel annoyed by it and you feel like you want to fight back, just remember that this is a blip of time in what's hopefully going to be a long and prosperous poker career, and just that's fine. They beat you today, big deal. Who cares? This isn't a pissing match. This is about who makes the most money at the end of your life, essentially, or who makes the most money at the end of your poker career. And that's basically the goal, and that's sort of the mantra I've followed. And it's worked out for me. I've made over $4 million in my poker career and profit. And I don't say that to brag, but I say that because I want to stress that this is the mentality that I've used. And a lot of people kind of wonder, what goes, how do I think about some of these situations? And so I just want to share it. So anyway, with that in mind, just let's be patient. You're going to build your 3-bet pot game. It's going to get better and better all the time. Don't get emotional about it. Just play your game. Let people have the 2 and 3 blind pots by 3-betting you and just folding pre-flop until you figure it out. It's not a big deal. You could be a huge winner in the game folding every single time someone 3-bet you and you had a weak hand. So don't worry about it. And until next time, good luck at the tables.